This video is based on articles by Tyler Greenfield. You can follow him on Twitter or find his blog in the description and comment section below. The horned dinosaurs are now so numerous that just about any arrangement of spires, scallops, notches, and whorls are hypothetically conceivable. One such horned face is not what it seems and is a Frankensteinian monster composed of spare parts. This chimera has remained in the paleontological zeitgeist for over 100 years, despite its anachronisms due to its commanding presence and role in the 1925 blockbuster The Lost World. Fending off carnivorous foe left and right with a crown of thorns, 2 eyebrow knives, and a snout lance meet the heavily armored and rotund Agathaumas, the horned dragon that never was. Charles R. Knight is one of the most well-known paleoartists of all time. His claim to fame lied in both his unmistakable talent in creating a tremendous sense of depth and utilization of the imperfections of his paints to foster a sense of realism never before used to bring the dead to life. From the 1890s until 1951, Knight had an illustrious career painting subjects of the natural world, which took him from the time of the dinosaurs to the Ice Age tar pits of LA, the then exotic wilds of Asia, and even to the front of the 1901 US $10 bill. He is also notable for being one of the first artists to depict dinosaurs as fast-moving, agile animals capable of far more than mud-wallowing in fetid swamps. Among the many paintings of the fearfully great reptiles he composed over his life, this one in particular depicts a homely-looking beast that has enraptured its viewers for the greater part of 100 years. This handsome horned himbo was labeled by Charles as Agathaumas. Such an Hellenistic-sounding name suggests a long, putrid history of conquest and gentrification, but thankfully to those that wish to keep their heads buried in the sand of ignorance, the story of Agathaumas never really traverses these depths. By now, the name Bone Wars should come as old hat, but for those that just went, let's dig our dirty fingers into that pie. The Bone Wars was an unofficial period in the history of paleontology in which 2 of the greatest collectors and descriptors of fossil fauna fought an intellectual battle to name the most extinct animals. Doctors Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh were once allied experts in the field of vertebrate paleontology in the early 1860s. Due to mitigating circumstances, particularly their strong, bullish personalities, they became bitter rivals. In the description of the marine reptile Allosaurus, Edward Cope mistakenly had it reconstructed with the skull on the tail rather than its extremely long neck. Though it was technically corrected by another paleontologist, Joseph Leidy, Othniel Marsh took ownership of dissing Cope's work.
This is the most obnoxious thing I've ever experienced in my life.
This last straw sparked the much more tumultuous battle to one-up each other from the 1870s to the 1890s. One unprecedented discovery during this period rustled many jimmies. In 1872, fossil remains of a tremendous oaf of a beast, hitherto undreamt of, were casually chipped out of a rock ledge in southwestern Wyoming. A pair of naturalists and paleontologists, Fielding Bradford Meek and Henry Martin Bannister, were the first to uncover the spoils of the earthen critter as part of the Geological Survey of the territories. Aware of what they had on their hands, they contacted the renowned Edward Drinker Cope and told him of the jackpot they'd made at Black Butte and Bitter Creek. Unquestionably excited by Meek and Bannister's find, Cope made sure to hoist his sorry carcass to the dig site to help procure all bones that might be in the immediate area.
Okay.
All told, the crew recovered 16 back, hip, and tail vertebrae, parts of the hip bones, and some other flotsam. The bones were preserved in a layer of consistent rock that has since been christened the Lance Formation, making the varmint one of the last living non-avian dinosaurs at 69 to 66 million years in age. The hip bones told Cope the creature was definitely a dinosaur, but what kind of dinosaur was a complete mystery at the time, since no other similar dinosaurs had yet been found. In a few sentences in the brief description he gave of the dinosaur, he compared it to the handful of known large-sized dinosaurs and still came up scratching his head. Without much fanfare, he simply slapped on a name for the beast as the very last sentence in his description: Agathaumas sylvestris. With the help of some etymologists and Cope's later publications, this name can be translated from the Greek agan for much, and thauma for wonder, and sylvestris for forest dweller. He presumably applied the species name forest dweller because of the inclusion of fossil twigs and leaves between the bones and in the dinosaurs surrounding rocky prison. As amazing a find as Agathaumas was, there wasn't anything more Cope could do with the bones once he described them. More specimens of a type similar to Agathaumas needed to be found. In 1876, a few years after the christening of the Wonder Beast, Cope and field assistants, including Charles H. Sternberg, collected a group of fossils along the miserable Missouri River in Montana, out of a layer of rock called the Judith River Formation. The assemblage of fossils they found included the majority of a whole skeleton. The problem is, they collected all of those pieces from different locations, which means their finds definitely didn't compose a single individual. Cope hastily described the remains in a paper only a few months later anyway. He attributed the name Monoclonius crassus, meaning single-sprouted fat one, to the bones due to the way the animal seemed to only have had one set of teeth in use at one time. A few years later, in 1889, Cope's rival O.C. Marsh described the remains of Triceratops, forcing Cope to re-examine his monoclonius material. This is where it gets even more complicated, but it'll all make sense in the end. Marsh's Triceratops description told Cope and the entire scientific community that Triceratops, Agathaumas, and Monoclonius were all of the same type of dinosaur, and that Agathaumas and Monoclonius should therefore look a lot more like Triceratops than was assumed at the time. In Cope's redescription of Monoclonius in 1889, he re-examined some of the bones he and Charles Sternberg had found back in 1876. Cope decided he had enough evidence to name 3 new species from these remains: Monoclonius recurvicornis, Stegosaurus, and Physis. Cope named Monoclonius recurvicornis off of a skull with a curved nasal horn core and 2 short brow horns. He named Monoclonius Stegosaurus off of a long nasal horn. The final one, Monoclonius Physis, was based on a single pterygoid bone. These fossils led Edward Cope to characterize this creature as more rhino-like in appearance. As he put it,
"It's an animal of large size, exceeding the rhinoceros in height, and the nasal horn is the most formidable weapon I have observed in a reptile."
Marsh's Triceratops cemented this group as large, barrel-bodied, horned, shelf-headed beasts of robust limbs and short tails. However, the slightly older Agathaumas name survived only in various papers by paleontologists who had not yet seen the synonymization of Agathaumas remains into other ceratopsians, or simply disagreed. For example, all the way back in 1874, Cope had also named Agathaumas Milo based on fossils of hadrosaurs. In 1892, R. Burkhardt made Agathaumas flabellatus based on fossils that would become Triceratops flabellatus, and eventually Triceratops horridus. In 1893, Richard Lydecker was responsible for Agathaumas prorsus, which just became Triceratops prorsus. Oliver Perry Hay did Agathaumas mortuarius in 1901 as an alternative form of a species of Polyonyx, both of which are Triceratops now. And Brent Breithaupt made Agathaumas monoclonius in 1994, which got lumped into Monoclonius Stegosaurus. So, with all these alternative names out of the way, what the hell actually is the original Agathaumas?
We don't care. Let me tell you something. We don't care.
The answer to that question is the reason the Agathaumas pieces have remained in an indeterminable state since their description. The only pieces of Agathaumas known are a chunk of the spine, right? Unfortunately for the Wonder Beast, back, hip, and tail vertebrae and hip pieces are basically all the same from one ceratopsian to the next. In scientific terms, the bones aren't diagnostic. These parts of the horned dinosaur skeleton don't change much over deep time as the different groups of horned dinosaurs evolved. They evidently were never forced to change too much as they didn't deviate drastically into other niches. So, the bones themselves are of no help in narrowing down an identity for Agathaumas. What else is? Time and rocks. Since the remains of Agathaumas come from a layer now known as the Lance Formation, they can be one of a few things. A. They are the remains of a distinct genus. B. The remains belong to Triceratops. C. The remains belong to Torosaurus. Or D. The remains belong to any one of the somewhat dubious ceratopsians that may have shared the ecosystem with Triceratops and Torosaurus, like Netaceratops or Tatankaceratops. This means Agathaumas has to at least be a Chasmosaurine ceratopsian. Chasmosaurines were a subgroup of horned dinosaurs known for large square-shaped head shields perforated by enormous openings and sporting shorter nose horns and longer brow horns, or short horns altogether. They are distinct from the Centrosaurine ceratopsians, which are unique for their shorter head shields, bulbous noses, larger nose horns, or large shield horns. The Centrosaurine horned dinosaurs did not coexist with Triceratops and Torosaurus, both of which are chasmosaurs. The simplest explanation here is that Agathaumas is just another specimen of Triceratops or Torosaurus and not a unique critter. In the original version of this video, I stated that no other unique horned dinosaurs have ever been found coexisting with Triceratops and Torosaurus throughout the US, but this has been shown to be unlikely. Though no other ceratopsian genera have been uncovered from the exact same rock layers as remains of Triceratops and Torosaurus, many new ceratopsians have been found from layers of rocks that date to the same time as those that contain Triceratops and Torosaurus. This means there is a strong possibility for overlap in geography between more than just the two genera. Sierraceratops is a New Mexican chasmosaur that comes from the Hall Lake Formation, which dates to between 83 and 66 million years ago. Regaliceratops from Alberta dates to 68.5 to 67.5 million years ago. And the New Mexican Ojoceratops is from 68 million years ago, making all of them within the same time frame as Triceratops and Torosaurus. So, it is possible the indeterminable remains of Agathaumas belong to a unique chasmosaur that lived around the same time as Triceratops and Torosaurus, but the plausibility is low. This didn't stop Cope from commissioning some fantastic paleoart from Charles R. Knight of his discovery. Cope had Knight make a series of illustrations he intended for an 1897 magazine article shortly before his death in April of the same year. Thanks to the troubling mess made of the Agathaumas monoclonius Triceratops remains, they were all drawn from as references for one creature. Cope suggested using the name Agathaumas sphenoceros for Knight's creation, an arbitrary combination of Agathaumas sylvestris and monoclonius sphenoceros. This piece by Knight renders the creature with a brilliant suit of crocodilian osteoderms, an enormous beak, a broad solid frill edged by spines reminiscent of Triceratops, Regaliceratops, and Styracosaurus, two short brow horns taken from Monoclonius recurvicornis, and a giant nose horn taken from Monoclonius sphenoceros. These body parts make this Knightian creation a chimera of chasmosaur and centrosaur features, something that would go on to be proven as a biological fact in the form of the Canadian Regaliceratops named in 2015. The animal had short brow horns, a large nose horn, and a short frill adorned by elaborate diamond-shaped occipital bones. It proves that the chasmosaurs were beginning to convergently evolve the traits of centrosaurs near the end of the late Cretaceous. This is likely due to the decline of all centrosaur lineages aside from the boss-nosed Pachyrhinosaurs. Check out my video on Regaloceratops to learn more about how weird the thing really is, link in the description and comment section below. The cool name and badass imagery pushed Agathaumas into popular culture. Since Charles R. Knight's works were the best and most well-known paleoart of the time, he was the main reference used when it came to doing anything with dinosaurs. Motion picture and stop-motion pioneer Willis O'Brien was tasked with completing the effects for Harry Hoyt's 1925 classic The Lost World. One of the many stop-motion puppets created for the film by O'Brien's underling, Marcel Delgado, was that of Charles Knight's Agathaumas. In the film, the horned dinosaur appears once to fend off an attacking Allosaurus. After disemboweling the rapacious carnivore, the Agathaumas is slain by a much larger Tyrannosaurus. Why isn't Agathaumas up there with the three-horned face itself then? Despite its immense initial popularity, the critter quickly faded into obscurity after The Lost World due to its much more well-known cousin, Triceratops. Agathaumas' fade to obscurity has resulted in many folks underestimating the scientific prowess of Charles R. Knight. The body of his Agathaumas is based mostly on Cope's rival Othniel Marsh's skeletal reconstruction of Triceratops. I mean, look at Cope's sketch of what he thought Agathaumas may have looked like. It's a shrink-wrapped version of Marsh's skeletal diagram. Oddly enough, this wouldn't be the last piece from his rival that Cope would take into his own noggin to use for his own horned beast. The suit of scutes and spikes peppering the hide of Knight's Agathaumas have always assumed to be the product of speculation, but it turns out Knight based it on what was thought to be direct fossil proof. As Tyler Greenfield lays out in his article on Agathaumas on his blog Inserte Cetus and published in the Prehistoric magazine, no osteoderms are currently known from any ceratopsian. Those patches of fossilized skin impressions that are known suggest a skin covered in both round and polygonal scales, with some exhibiting nipple-shaped projections. The world-renowned Henry Fairfield Osborn of the American Museum of Natural History wrote about Knight's Agathaumas in an article in 1898. He noted the armor was only speculation, and this is the explanation which has stuck to Knight's work throughout the 130 years. Osborn wrote,
"The frilled dinosaur, Agathaumas spinoceros, is based upon a prior restoration published by Professor O.C. Marsh of his Triceratops prorsus. This genus and species being distinguished from Triceratops by the large anterior median horn and the small posterior paired horns. In addition to the powerful horns, the skull is protected by a great bony collar or frill, which is surrounded by heavily barbed tubercles. The tubercular character also given by Mr. Knight to the epidermis is conjectural."
Tyler Greenfield has found proof that Knight was far more in the know about scientific findings at the time of his Agathaumas commission. An 1891 article by Othniel Charles Marsh provided a plate illustrating an assortment of isolated bits and pieces found in the Lance Formation of Wyoming, which happens to be the same layer Agathaumas was excavated from. Marsh thought the osteoderms in the assortment were from Triceratops due to their origin in the same rock layers and because he assumed it was allied with Stegosaurus. He gave some notes on how he thought they'd be arranged on the body, but didn't go into great detail on them. Marsh wrote,
"Besides the armature of the skull, the body also in the Ceratopsidae was protected. The nature and position of the defensive parts in the different forms cannot yet be determined with certainty, but various spines, bosses, and plates have been found that clearly pertain to the dermal covering of Triceratops or nearly allied genera. Several of these ossifications were probably placed on the back, behind the crest of the skull, and some of these smaller ones may have defended the throat, as in Stegosaurus."
O.C. Marsh was clearly confident enough in his identification to publish it, but they were never found attached to a Triceratops skeleton. So that's a little weird. I doubt any of you are thinking these assorted bits and bobs actually belong to Triceratops. In fact, if we take a closer look, we should be able to identify each of them given 130 years of hindsight. Figure 1 through 3 has since been re-identified as a spine which would have been placed on the neck or shoulder of a nodosaur. Doctors Ken Carpenter and Brent Breithaupt assigned the bone to the roly-poly Edmontonia in 1986. Since it's from the Lance Formation of Wyoming, making it from the latest Cretaceous, it should actually belong to Denversaurus schleismani, a close relative to Edmontonia. Figure 4 through 7 is a picture-perfect osteoderm from an ankylosaurian, and therefore probably fits into the chainmail of Denversaurus as well. Tyler Greenfield has a suspicion that it may belong to the cervical rings of the dinosaur, part of the armored collar which protected its burly neck. Figure 8 to 10 is probably also a scoot from a Denversaurus-type dinosaur, but looks to be a much smaller one that could have fit anywhere on the body. The more interesting of this group is figure 11 and 12. This spiny fossil was classified as the right squamosal horn of the pachycephalosaurid Stygimoloch spinifer by Dr. Peter Galton and Dr. Hans-Dieter Suess in 1983. The details which convinced Tyler of the inspiration for Knight's spiny Agathaumas is the similarity between the Stygimoloch material and the spines running down the back of Knight's creature, and the similarity between the Denversaurus neck spine and the spikes lining the frill. I have to agree with Tyler here, but my eyes were first drawn to how similar the neck scoot in the diagram is to the scoots you see on the ceratopsian sides. All of the elements collected in Marsh's diagram line up surprisingly well with the assortment of integumentary structures Knight pile onto his wonderbeast. The armor Knight applied to the creature's backsides, frill, and throat mirror Marsh's speculation. Since Knight was already sifting through the contemporary scientific literature, it tracks that he would also see Marsh's diagram and speculations and implement them into his paleoart for Cope. As Greenfield notes, obviously no one can know for sure since Knight, to anyone's knowledge, never published a confirmation of his references for the piece. In a moment of paleoart zen, another contemporary paleoartist of Knight reconstructed Triceratops, also carrying armor embedded in its hide. This handsome fellow, drawn by Joseph Smith, was published a few years before Knight's work in 1893, and clearly shows some of the same osteoderm armor embedded in the flanks and back. Those scoots nearest to the creature's neck look quite similar to the pachycephalosaurid squamosals, and that's on purpose. Smith credits Marsh and the Stygimoloch bones used as reference, so we know he used Marsh's speculations. Whether Knight was influenced by Smith's art or if the two convergently developed the idea is the big unknown. Whatever the case may be, it definitely tells you Marsh's speculative note was known not just by the stuffy academics or trailblazing amateurs, but also by the monster makers and paleoartists of the time. Agathaumas, a chimeric creature which has romped through our books and across the silver screen, remains one of the mascots of paleontology history. Though its body was that of Triceratops, its horns that of two different centrosaurs, and armor a conglomerate of nodosaur and pachycephalosaur, it fits right in with the tail-dragging Tyrannosaurus and semi-aquatic Trachodon, representing a time when the past was stereotyped as a never-ending barrage of death and destruction in an unfeeling world which pitted animals against each other in boggy swamps and marshes until the light of man could transform it into the metropolis it is today. An outdated notion for sure, but sometimes a welcome one. For more interesting stories about nature, the history of life, or what goes bump in the night, subscribe, like this video, drop a comment in the comment section below, and hit the bell icon to stay in the know with everything Edge. Thanks for watching.